I'm Nisha Cassell, Executive Director of the African American Museum of Iowa. Thank you for inviting me to celebrate with you the renaming of your junior high school to the Susan Clark Junior High School. What a great day in Muscatine and across Iowa as we mark this milestone that is now part of all of our history and a reflection of strides that have been made toward equal educational opportunities for all students. The Clark family and their story serve as an inspiration and a reminder that change is not something to wait for, but rather something that each of us should look for the opportunity to make. Susan Clark was the daughter of Alexander Clark, who was born a free man, and Catherine Clark, who lived her first 3 years in slavery. Alexander was a prominent citizen and a staunch activist for equal rights for all citizens. When Iowa enacted black codes that made it difficult and then impossible for black people to settle in the state in the mid-1800s, Mr. Clark gathered as many supporters as he could and petitioned the government for change. As black Americans fleeing slavery made their way through Iowa along the Underground Railroad, Mr. Clark risked his legal standing to help. And when the U.S. allowed black men into the military, he jumped at the chance to enlist his neighbors and friends. Clark gave up his bonuses to help the men fill the gap left due to unequal pay and attempted to lessen the impact of the negative treatment they received as soldiers. When the war came to an end, Clark again took to petitioning the government, this time using the courage and bravery of now proven black soldiers as justification that black Americans deserved the right to vote. But Alexander Clark was not the only activist in his family. At just 12 years old, Clark's daughter Susan was asked to step into this role when her family attempted to break free from segregation and applied for her enrollment into school number 2 in Muscatine. Because she was black and because of the community's opposition to integration, the Clark's application was denied. It was then that the Clarks pressed the issue, suing the Muscatine Board of School Directors for Susan's enrollment to be granted. The Clark's case was a cutting edge of progress. The Civil War and slavery came to an end in 1865, and it wasn't until 1868 that suffrage was extended to black men in Iowa, and that would not be true for the U.S. until 1870. But in 1867, the Clarks were challenging the state to desegregate schools. When the case arrived in the Iowa Supreme Court, it was no longer just about Susan, but all black students in Iowa. When 4 Republican justices of the Iowa Supreme Court passed down their ruling in 1868, Susan Clark became the first black student to go to integrated schools in Iowa and the United States. Her case and her family's activism served as a nationwide foundation. Together with a number of subsequent legal challenges to school desegregation nationwide, the Clarks laid the groundwork for the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education that enforced integrated schooling nationwide. So here we are today. What a tribute not only to Susan Clark, but the entire Clark family's legacy of activism for all people to be treated equally and just. Susan Clark Junior High is a reminder of the past and an inspiration for the future. Each of us can be advocates in our own communities, pursuing justice and equality for all. So thank you for having me here today to celebrate with you, and congratulations to you all and the city of Muscatine on the Susan Clark Junior High School.
Good morning. My name is Russell Lovell. I'm a professor emeritus of law at the Drake University Law School. I have had a keen interest in the Clark versus Muscatine school board case for many years, and widely considered a catalyst for a major program that the law school of both the Drake Law School and the University of Iowa College of Law, along with the Iowa Supreme Court, had as a sesquicentennial celebration of the case 2 years ago in 2018. I was also honored to be selected to give a program talk for the Alexander Clark Day celebration that occurred this past February of 2018. I'm honored to be able to speak in terms of the dedication and renaming of the Susan Clark Junior High School here in Muscatine. It seems to be coming at the most timely and appropriate time as the nation reflects on the historic election of the first woman to serve as vice president of the United States Senator Kamala Harris, a woman of African American and Asian descent. During the campaign, Senator Harris personally spoke of her own school integration experience in Berkeley, California's public schools, and touted the education she received in Berkeley as the foundation of her life's success. It would be fair to say that a young African American girl in Muscatine, Iowa, paved the way for our new vice president-elect and for the educational opportunity for millions of children of color. The Muscatine School District's video, Susan Clark, Determined to Lead is an excellent biography of her, but it opens with a question from Makina, a 12-year-old child from Washington, D.C., who asked, who was the first Black child to go to an integrated school? The online publication, The Conversation, invited me to write a response to that question, and I did, and I provide the link to you that you might want to, and my remarks today are an adaptation of that Curious Kids article. When people think about the time when Black people first began to integrate America's public schools, they usually think of the 1960s. Indeed, Kamala Harris was a 6-year-old student in the second integrated class at Berkeley's Thousand Oaks Elementary School in the year 1970. And indeed, there is a mural there that honors the extraordinary women graduates of that elementary school, including our president-elect. But history shows that the first court-ordered school integration case took place in the 1860s, not the 1960s. Indeed, April of 1868, 3 years after the end of the Civil War, Susan Clark from Muscatine became the first Black child to attend an integrated school by virtue of a court order. That order was issued by the Iowa Supreme Court, and when it made its historic ruling in a school desegregation case brought on her behalf by her father, Alexander Clark Sr. Yes, this was 86 years before the United States Supreme Court issued its Brown versus Board of Education decision that ordered the desegregation of the nation's schools. In the Iowa case, Iowa Supreme Court Justice Cole ruled that the Muscatine Board's racial segregation policy was unconstitutional. That ruling made the Iowa Supreme Court the first court in the nation to hold that segregation was unlawful. It also made the Iowa Supreme Court the only court in the 19th century to hold segregation illegal as a matter of constitutional law under the Iowa Constitution's equality provision. Let me grab it right here. Okay. The 1857 Constitution, the opening words of that Constitution are ones of equality. You will wonder perhaps, well, what about the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause of the federal Constitution? It had not yet been ratified. That occurred several months later in 1868, so it wasn't before the court and available in this case. The video, Susan Clark, Determined to Learn, has provided an excellent biography of Susan, so I'm not going to duplicate that. I'll try to just focus on some of the aspects of the case in which was so important, and her courage, and then the actual implementation. The Muscatine School Board didn't try to hide the reason that it rejected Susan's application to attend her neighborhood school. They said that its decision was to keep the students segregated was in line with, quote, public sentiment that's opposed to the intermingling of white and colored children in the same schools. The school board went on to argue that its schools were separate but equal. And of course, that argument worked in a lot of other courts at that time, including the Supreme Courts of Massachusetts, New York, and California, states that we typically think of as on the progressive side of racial justice issues. Well, that argument didn't work in the Iowa Supreme Court. Justice Chester Cole pointed out that the very first words of that 1857 Iowa Constitution speak about equal rights to all. And he wrote that segregation went against the nation's governmental policy to, quote, organize into one harmonious people, end quote, and that to uphold segregation, quote, would tend to perpetuate the national differences of our people and stimulate a constant strife, if not a war of the races, end quote. The Clark decision was a courageous and visionary decision that articulated a powerful vision of an inclusive society. There's words and text there that are still valuable to the United States as we speak to this very day. While there is no indication in the records that Susan Clark experienced open hostility, such as the threats and taunts from the white students or their parents in Muscatine, as was often the case when Black children integrated schools in the 1960s, but court-ordered integration almost always met with resistance. We know in nearby Keokuk that integration there a few years later resulted in the closure of the former Black schools there and the layoff of the Black teachers. There may have been a more muted resistance, but we can be confident that Susan Clark's success required courage and perseverance. She was the pathbreaker, the trailblazer for others, as were her parents, who stood up for racial equality in filing the lawsuit. Alexander Sr. had achieved much success as a businessman and a leader in Muscatine, but don't doubt that pursuing a school desegregation lawsuit certainly risked retaliation that could have put at risk the family's livelihood. And indeed, as the Susan Clark video reported, when the Clark family home was destroyed by fire a few years later, it was widely believed that arson was the cause. Well, as the African proverb, "It takes a village," expresses, there are others in Muscatine whose courage should be lauded for their contribution to the success of this lawsuit. Not only it created civil rights and educational equality, not only in Muscatine, but in Iowa and in the nation. The law firm of Richmond and Card-Stadden, who represented the Clarks at the local level, it took courage to do that. Iowa Attorney General Henry O'Connor, who lived in Muscatine, represented Susan Clark on her oral argument before the Iowa Supreme Court. He was also one of the leaders in the women's suffragette movement at that time. And of course, District Judge Scott Richmond, whose initial ruling in the case favored Susan, set the stage for the school board's appeal to the Iowa Supreme Court. I also want to give a bravo to the Muscatine Journal, whose editorials supported the Clarks and their efforts to integrate the public schools, and to the citizens of Muscatine, whose respect for the rule of law caused them to accept the Supreme Court's decision, even though it appears a majority probably disagreed with it. Muscatine did not experience the fierce resistance to the Supreme Court's order, as happened 100 years later when Southern school districts balked at implementation of Brown versus Board of Education. The resistance of one of those cases, that the Prince Edward County case, that was a case that was consolidated with the Brown case in 1954, the school board went so far as to close the public schools for 5 years rather than comply with the integration orders. So not only did Susan Clark go on to study at Grammar School No. 2, her neighborhood school, but she became the first Black graduate of a public high school in Iowa in 1871 and was selected to give the commencement address. And as I said, I'm not going to go through all of the outstanding things that she accomplished in her lifetime, but I think that those are in the Susan Clark video. What a wonderful life she had, what contributions she made to her community and in the joint ministry of her and her husband, the Reverend Holly. You may wonder why and how the Iowa Supreme Court made such a progressive decision on racial equality so far ahead of the rest of the nation. Well, 4 of the justices on the court were Republicans. That was the party of Abraham Lincoln, and each had been a strong supporter of the Union cause in the Civil War. Chester Cole, the author of the opinion, was an early advocate for the extension of the right to vote to Black men because of their valiant service in the Union Army during the Civil War, including Black men here in Iowa. It's important not only to praise the courage of the court at that time in 1868 to take these steps, but also the courage of the court never to back down from this decision. Because 28 years later, the United States Supreme Court decided the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, and there they upheld separate but equal as being sufficient under the federal Constitution. But because the Clark decision was decided under the Iowa Constitution's Equality Clause, the Iowa court did not have to follow the Plessy decision, and it never did. It allowed the Clark integration ruling to remain the law of the land for the next 58 years, and then finally, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954, in the Brown decision, held that they overruled the Plessy case and held that the federal Equal Protection Clause required the desegregation of schools nationwide. One more caveat with regard to the Clark case. The fact that it was decided under the Iowa Constitution's Equality Clause means that it has continuing vitality and relevance today. It is the legal precedent for some of the court's most recent important equality decisions, including the decision of Varnum versus Breen in 2009, the marriage equality decision that granted gays the right to marry. They relied upon the language that, this is a quote from Justice Marcia Turnus of the court, "There is no principle of law that requires the Iowa Supreme Court to interpret the Iowa Constitution in line with the United States Constitution, as long as our interpretation does not violate any provision of the federal Constitution." In other words, although this court cannot interpret the Iowa Constitution to provide less protection than that provided by the United States Constitution, the court is free to interpret our Constitution as providing greater protection for our citizens' constitutional rights. And that's precisely what the court did in Varnum versus Breen in 2009. Most recently, just 1 year ago in 2019, in the case of State versus Lilly. And I'm proud to say that the NAACP, I helped author an amicus brief in that case, in which we persuaded the Iowa Supreme Court to recognize that under the Iowa Constitution's impartial jury clause, that again, the court should provide for a greater commitment to a fair cross-section of the community in terms of racial composition of those juries than is required by the United States Supreme Court's Sixth Amendment impartial jury clause as well. In closing, I'd like to indicate, and I'm sure Adrien will second this, both of the state's law schools, the University of Iowa's College of Law and the Drake University Law School, are really proud of our connection to this historic case. Susan Clark's brother, her father, became the first and I think the second African-American graduate of the University of Iowa College of Law. Justice Chester Cole, the Iowa Supreme Court justice who authored the opinion, is the co-founder of the Drake University Law School in 1881 and the dean of the law school for many years. The case, you may say, well, how special was it? Well, Chief Justice Mark Cady in his 2018 State of the Judiciary speech to the legislature called it a defining moment for the Iowa Supreme Court. And as I've mentioned to Tony, the Drake Law School, in conjunction with the Iowa Supreme Court and the University of Iowa College of Law, hosted a week-long celebration of the Clark decision on its sesquicentennial in 2018. There is still, and we maintain it, a webpage that's exclusively dedicated to all of the research and the papers that were part of that. It's a truly valuable resource collecting a wide variety of original materials on the Clark decisions, on the Clarks themselves, and I encourage you to check it out. Again, it seemed like what an appropriate moment to do this celebration in light of the election of Kamala Harris. And yes, indeed, Susan Clark was the trailblazer, the pathbreaker that set all this in motion. Thank you very much.
My name is Adrien Wing. I am the Bessie Dutton Murray Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Iowa College of Law. I am also Associate Dean of International and Comparative Law Programs. It is a great honor to be asked to contribute today to this wonderful dedication of the Susan Clark Junior High School in Muscatine. While the Clark family may be famous in Muscatine or even in Greater Iowa, it is unfortunate that most Americans do not know about them on a national level. As a professor at the Iowa Law School for over 30 years, I would like to add to this celebration by commenting on the Clark family and on those members of that family that had legal training. Alexander Clark Sr., the father of Susan, graduated from the Iowa College of Law in 1884 at the age of 57. He was number 8 in a class of 80. He was the second Black graduate of the College of Law. Now note that date, 1884. for is almost 20 years after the Clark case. You wonder how much was he influenced to attend law school by the fact that he, as the parent or one of two parents, had successfully been able to pursue that case and gain a legal victory. While Alexander Clark Sr. was at Iowa, he was very popular and was known as a gifted orator. He was regularly featured in the student newspaper for his stirring lectures and his debates about civil rights and women's rights. Here we are talking about the 1880s. Sandy Boyd, who is a retired law professor and the former president of the University of Iowa, said that Clark Sr. deserves to be considered in the same breath as the great civil rights pioneers. He was certainly one of the great graduates of the University of Iowa and the College of Law. Alexander Clark Jr., the younger brother of Susan, had an opportunity that she did not. He was Iowa Law's first Black graduate, class of 1879, and there is a plaque of Clark Jr. along with other Iowa firsts in the front lobby of the law school. Clark Jr. practiced law with his dad and co-owned a prominent Black newspaper with him. He was a leader in his community, including with the Masons and the AME Church. Our Black Law Student Association is named the Alexander G. Clark Sr. and Jr. Chapter. We have hosted an essay contest for high school students bearing the name of these two great alums of our law school. Too often, women and girls are forgotten in history. The average student mainly learns of the famous white men who are seen as creating history, with a token woman and/or person of color stirred in. By naming this junior high school for Susan Clark, she takes a very prominent, visible, permanent place in the public sphere for her incredible family, for the town of Muscatine, for the state of Iowa, and the United States. She was the first Black graduate of a public school in our state, and she was the Muscatine High School commencement speaker. She lived a rich, full life until the age of 70 after she married Mr. Holly, and she is buried in the Muscatine Greenwood Cemetery. I won't go into further details about her amazing life because there's that wonderful video now available to all of us. I imagine that her mother, Catherine Griffin Clark, must have been a phenomenal person to nurture such an amazing group of children and to be a supportive spouse to Alexander Clark Sr., who ended his career by being the first ambassador to the country of Liberia. Perhaps one day we will find out a lot more about Catherine Griffin Clark and the role that she played. I hope that all the children who will attend this school and everyone in the town learn about Susan, whether it's in the classroom or outside of it. I have 15 grandchildren. They live in Iowa City, Des Moines, and Cedar Falls. I plan to bring those grandchildren to Muscatine to see the junior high school and to pose in front of it with the name of Susan Clark behind them. I hope that her example of courage, dedication, and excellence gets communicated to future generations throughout our state and throughout our nation. I want to close with my favorite poem, which is by Maya Angelou, called Still I Rise. To me, this poem symbolizes the strength, beauty, and determination of Susan Clark. It is also a fitting poem as we are on the verge of getting the first Black and South Asian Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. I am sure there will be many schools who will be named for Kamala Harris. So here is the poem. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room? Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides. Just like hope springing high, still I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard? 'Cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my backyard. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got oil wells at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bearing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. Thank you all very much.
Who was Susan Clark? When the Muscatine School Board renamed the combined middle schools for her in 2019, many residents said they had never heard of her. Susan Clark was just 13 years old when she became the first Black student in the United States to integrate a public school through a court order. A landmark decision in Susan's favor by the Iowa Supreme Court in 1868 gave all Iowa children the right to attend public schools regardless of race, religion, nationality, and any other distinction. That Iowa ruling happened shortly after the Civil War ended and 2 years before the nation allowed Black men to vote. Segregated schools were the norm in many states until the 1954 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education. Susan's case, 86 years earlier, was cited as a precedent in that decision. The second daughter of Catherine and Alexander Clark, Susan grew up at the corner of the West 3rd and Chestnut Streets. Today, that corner is the site of the parking garage at the Clark House Apartments, which is named for her father. Susan's older sister, Rebecca, and younger brother, Alexander Jr., were school pioneers as well. In September 1865, 2 years before the famous case, Susan and her siblings attended their neighborhood public school number 2, just 3 blocks from their house, but for only 2 days, before the school board resolved that no Negroes should attend the public schools. The Muscatine Journal editorialized that this was a gross injustice since the Clarks were paying taxes for the public schools. But the decision stood. In September 1867, Susan again tried to enroll at the school number 2. Again, she was turned away. but she was determined to continue her education after finishing her studies at the African school held at the African Methodist Episcopal Church, nearly a mile from her home. On October 10, 1867, Susan and her father sued in district court for her right to attend the public school. They won, but the school board appealed. Finally, in late spring, the state Supreme Court issued the historic ruling. It had taken an entire school year, but Susan was now able to attend the public schools, and so she enrolled at the high school that fall. Unfortunately, her high school years had many challenges and perhaps moments of hostility. But Susan persevered and graduated with honors in 1871, the first Black high school graduate in Iowa. Muscatine High School was then at West 3rd in Iowa, just a block from her home, which was on top floor of a hotel building that still stands as part of the Welsh Apartments. The fact that Susan was chosen to be one of the graduation speakers attests to her high moral character and leadership. Think of the courage and fortitude she must have had, and her desire for education. Later in life, Susan married the Reverend Richard Hawley in 1877. A year later, her childhood home was destroyed by fire, likely from arson, and her parents rebuilt it into the fine brick home you can see today, where it was moved some 200 feet up West 3rd Street. In 1879, Susan's brother, Alexander Jr., became the first Black graduate of the University of Iowa College of Law. Unfortunately, we still have not found any verified photos of Susan, but artists have made the renditions of what she might have looked like. Some researcher might someday find that picture. As an AME minister's wife, she was active in her church and community. The Iowa State Bystander, Iowa's Black newspaper, reported her involvement with the Colored Order of the Eastern Stars, Heroines of Jericho, JSY Club, and One More Effort Club. She was also a leader in the Iowa Federation of Afro-American Women and statewide chairperson of the Mother's Child Study Committee, which encouraged women to train and educate their youngsters in deportment, civic responsibility, and the arts. Mrs. Hawley lived most of her married life in Cedar Rapids from 1887 to 1914, where she was known as a popular dressmaker with her own shop. Reverend and Mrs. Hawley also lived in Champaign, Illinois, Davenport, Keokuk, and Waterloo, Iowa. The Hawleys had 3 children, but sadly, none lived more than a month. Although there are no known photographs and written records are scarce, there is one news item from an 1898 paper which stands out as an illustration of Susan's character as an adult. While she was a passenger and she was in a train wreck, and after listing the 2 dead and many injured and describing the heroics of the crew and first responders, a single sentence reports, Mrs. S.V. Hawley, a colored woman, promptly left her perilous position in one of the cars and ministered to the injured. After her husband died in 1914, Susan resided in Chicago with her sister's daughter. She died of diabetes in 1925 at age 71 and was buried in the family plot at Greenwood Cemetery in Muscatine. Muscatine's young people should be proud to claim native daughter Susan Clark, to emulate her courage and determination. Iowa Supreme Court Justice Mark Cady lauded her example, saying, "It's important to recognize how the story of one person, in this case Susan Clark, can become the story of an entire nation, and how the story of one person can lead to change that makes us all better."